Today I'm talking about one of my favorite addictions, drugs. I'm a big fan of drugs, at least hallucinogens, but I realize this isn't normal. Plenty of people refuse to venture past marijuana, and some don't even feel comfortable drinking. I'm sure federal laws contribute to this drug prudery, but there's also a cultural stigma, particularly in the US, towards those who enjoy drugs for recreation. This is thanks in part to a long history of government propaganda that is now a part of our societal fabric. The war on drugs was able to successfully use racial and cultural tensions to get the white middle class to associate drugs with hippies and minorities. This flamed their fears and allowed the government to bring down the hammer. In 1994, Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, admitted the true motives behind the war on drugs.
We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Not long after, Reagan would kickstart the Just Say No campaign and push for severe penalties for drug-related crimes. Consequently, incarcerations for nonviolent crimes rose dramatically. Then, only a few years later, in 1987, Reagan did something which should have raised more than a few eyebrows. He passed his executive order, Reagan's Commission on Privatization, which birthed the enormous for-profit prison system we know today. He made incarceration a business and campaigned a war that would make it very lucrative. But this should come as no surprise. The US government has always crafted their drug laws to line the pockets of a few at the expense of the many. Currently, the government protects the mega business of pharmaceutical opioids, which have caused major epidemics, while also conducting witch hunts against cheap, safe alternatives like kratom, which can help addicts break free from their addiction. This powerful cultural stigma, designed by those in charge, is alive and well. So I'm very careful to never expose my own predilections. Only rarely, if I really trust someone, will I bring up drugs. I often just want to hear their thoughts on the matter, know if they've ever experimented, or why they haven't. 9 times out of 10, the person I'm talking to has no interest in drugs beyond weed or alcohol. And if I ask as to why, they typically give one of 2 reasons. 1, they don't like giving up control, or 2, they're scared of what they'll see. Those responses are usually in reference to hallucinogens, and what I'll be focusing on, because a lot of drugs are party drugs, used for euphoria with no permanent benefit to the individual, and I could care less if others take or leave them. But hallucinogens, I believe, can provide personal growth. They open a pathway that allows us to understand ourselves better, dive deeper into areas normally protected by sobriety. The ultimate goal is to reach an ego death, or ego dissolution as it's now being called, so we can be reborn. As always, we'll need to gather some data, scrap together some theories, and see if there's anything of substance to what I'm saying, or if all my drug use has just poked one too many holes in my brain. Back in the 50s, 2 researchers, Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer, were pioneering the field of psychedelic research. They believed the unique properties of psychosis-inducing agents could cure alcoholism. Their jumping-off point was noting that severe alcoholics often hit a low point, a moment when the severity of their disease dawned on them, and a powerful fear drove them to sobriety. If you've gone to AA meetings, you'll hear countless tales of this low point. Sometimes it's the fear of failing as a parent or losing a spouse, but most often it's the fear of death, which they notice is their ultimate trajectory, that brings about this redemptive moment. Osmond and Hoffer figured they could trigger this fear, induce it, by giving patients mescaline or LSD, and thus scare them into sobriety. However, after going through with the experiment, the results were not what they expected. Some did have bad trips leading to a redemptive fear, but many had powerful positive experiences that helped them overcome their addiction. I bring up this particular bit of history because it highlights the black and white expectations we have for psychedelics. They will either produce a good trip or a bad trip, but speaking practically, that subjective view is rarely important. In Osmond and Hoffer's experiment, whether a subject felt their trip was good or bad is besides the point. If it subdued their addiction, it was a successful trip. Psychologist Arthur Klepps found that when asking LSD users exactly what they meant by a bad trip, users simply described trips that contained disquieting experiences, regardless of how they felt afterwards. Many who had a bad trip even looked back on it positively. This led Arthur to create a definition for bad trips to avoid further confusion. A bad trip would be defined as one that left the user worse off than they were going in. Psychedelics can be scary, especially at high doses, but that doesn't mean they produce a bad trip. It's actually often through the darker confrontations in our mind that we achieve a transformation for the better. This is why alcoholics can be sobered by confronting their own mortality, and why exposure therapy is used to treat PTSD patients and phobias. By unpacking our fears and submerging in them, we learn how to overcome them. The only thing standing in our way is our ego. Egos are, for the uninitiated, the self. Your ego is your inner monologue, your memory, your planning, your consciousness. Freud gave the analogy of a man on a horse.
Your ego is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse,
which in this analogy is the unconscious. And what drugs allow us to do is shake up our ego, possibly to the point of no longer recognizing it. And if we can get to that point, then we can gain some perspective, step back and critique or appreciate ourselves as if we're a separate person, because in that moment, we essentially are.
Get ready for the big surprise. You are not you. You're me. No shit.
In neuroscience, there's a term default mode network, and what that describes is an interconnected area of our brain that fires when we think internally. When we daydream, self-reflect, think about a memory from childhood. It's our metacognitive activities that arise when we're not focused on a task, hence the name default mode network. It's what mindfulness tries to quiet, the chattering of our minds at rest. And psychedelics do something very interesting to this network. They shut it down. Instead, new connections start forming in the brain. Emotions begin talking to visuals, memory to hearing. It dissolves our ingrained pathways and allows for entirely new connections. An analogy given by Michael Pollan illustrates this very well.
Think of your mind as a hill covered in snow, and your thoughts are sleds going down that hill. And after a while, after a lot of thoughts have gone that hill, there'll be these grooves, and they're going to get deeper and deeper. And at a certain point, you can't go down the hill without slipping into those grooves. That's who we are as we're at this age. And what psychedelics do, he said, is flatten the snow. Lots of fresh powder. And you can then take the sled any way you want to go.
That's a great way of describing it. I've always talked about elk antlers.
However, the suppression of the DMN, as we'll call it, can be worrisome. In a lot of ways, the DMN sounds just like our ego, and without the ego around to protect us, steer us away from thoughts that reveal our negative qualities or create anxiety, the experience can feel threatening. If you've never taken a psychedelic, the closest equivalent I can think of would be weed. Many, including myself, tend to get very anxious when high. It increases self-reflection, and from an altered perception, we're able to be far more critical of our sober selves. You may think about how you treated someone rudely, or how embarrassing a comment you made was.
Hey, slide through, cause a nigga wants some head. I'ma hit her one time, then I'll leave her ass on.
And it hurts our ego. Let's call these experiences ego stabs. They're light critiques from a more introspective self. Some take these ego stabs as constructive criticism, use them to better themselves and keep their ego in check. Others, though, find even this amount of ego violence too uncomfortable. Perhaps they've lived decades with unpacked emotions or little self-reflection. In that case, an experience forcing intrusive self-critiquing thoughts may simply be too much to handle. Psychedelics obviously pose a far greater threat to the ego. Your ego runs the risk of being stabbed or even killed. Once taken, the ego is powerless. It's no longer controlling the horse. Instead, it's being dragged along by the acid, peyote, DMT, whatever. Psychedelics can't be controlled. There's no deciding when it's over, how intense it will be, or where it goes. It can be steered, sure, that's why there are professional psychedelic guides, but for the most part, your mind is just unleashed, and you have to take a backseat and just try to enjoy the ride. Any seasoned psychonaut knows this to be true. The uninitiated, though, may not. A first-timer may find the lack of control too terrifying and fight the drug tooth and nail. However, the more an ego fights against a trip, the worse it will be. It will resemble a bad trip.
I'm fucked up! I'm fucked up!
Going in, one needs to accept that your mind will present to you what it needs to, and all you can do is ride that wave. If you're comfortable with that and prepared for something more, you can go much further and have a truly transformative experience. Ego death is quite simply a loss of self, death of the I. You have no name, no body, no identity to speak of. Unsurprisingly, many recount that experience as terrifying. In that moment of ego death, who they had lived as up till that point had ceased to be, or more accurately, the illusion of the self that they had never been without suddenly disappeared. Speaking philosophically, the self is an illusion. Our minds are merely electrical firings, and yet they create an entire perception of reality, one that's able to contemplate the future, the past, even imagine our death. To be able for a moment in time to shut that off is truly a unique experience and undoubtedly horrifying. What's actually happening during ego dissolution is still being researched, but a study from 2020 gives us some idea. Patients were given enough psilocybin to generate ego dissolution effects, and then examined in an MRI. The results showed that the more intense ego dissolution was, the more glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter, was observed in the medial prefrontal cortex, and less was observed in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is integral to memory and a major part of the DMN, and as ego death was approached, its activity was diminished. The ability to retrieve memories and information about the self was lessened, which makes a lot of sense. However, the increase in glutamate activity in the medial prefrontal cortex isn't as straightforward. The medial prefrontal cortex is also a big player in the DMN, responsible for self-reflection, but yet it was enhanced, not diminished. The study also measured whether the experience of ego dissolution was perceived as positive or negative by the patient, and it turns out that those who had a higher rise in glutamate in the medial prefrontal cortex perceived their experience as negative. Those who had a lower glutamate activity in the hippocampus perceived their experience as positive. We can't theorize much from these findings, but it does lead me to believe that not all ego deaths are the same. Ego deaths will always destabilize the DMN, but depending upon which parts diminish or rise in activity, they will provide very different experiences. Perhaps those with increased activity in the prefrontal cortex were just unlucky. But maybe the reason they had a negative experience was because they resisted, even unknowingly, with their ego. There's simply not enough research to give us a complete understanding of this topic, thanks to the government making research on Schedule I drugs a painful process, so I'm forced to rely on less concrete info to wrap this up. I've experienced ego death once, and it was from all things salvia, before they made it illegal in most US states. I was a freshman in college. I remember it was night. I was sitting down in a parking lot hanging out with friends, and one by one we were taking a hit. Salvia produces a very short-lived high, minutes, maybe even less, with minor lingering effects after. I don't remember taking the hit, I just remember where it took me. I no longer perceived having a body. I had no shape or volume. I felt as if I was a god, but a god that was merely an observer for all things. I existed in a black void, and all that was in front of me was a book that contained all life in existence throughout time and space, and I was its reader. I was omniscient, content to observe all. I was filled with wonder and contentment, until that began to fade away. I felt being pulled into the book, into some inconsequential subnote. I was being assigned to some insignificant being residing on Earth, in America, in the year of 2009. I remember as it all started unraveling, the feeling of why. Why 2009 out of all possible moments in time? Why America? Why a college student? It felt like such an unimportant role, so trivial. The return to my body was jarring. It felt like a collision. I didn't recognize my body, where I was, nor all the faces around me laughing. I asked them, who am I? What's my name? And they only laughed. I didn't know their names either, nor did I really care to. It seemed to pale in comparison to where I had just been. The fact that I had to now carry on as some irrelevant boy attending college seemed like such a strange fate. I didn't know his life or what to do with it. The experience shook me to the core. I had fully seen how insignificant I was. I look back now and consider that experience a positive one. Up till that point in life, I placed such a strong importance on things I consider trivial now, but I started repeating this mantra, one that I'd repeat whenever I was anxious. None of this matters. I am insignificant. We all are. Each of us are just tiny little markings in the enormous book of existence, so who cares about all the little stuff? It doesn't matter what others think about you or if you screw up. This is all just an insignificant blip. None of it matters. I still get embarrassed, I still have to suffer anxiety, but it's easier to let those feelings go now. They don't stop me from doing what I want. Since all ego deaths are different, not everyone will walk away with the same lesson I did, but I do think any form of ego dissolution levels a person, knocks them down a bit to gain some humility. Egocentric people are so caught up in thinking their lives matter, their wants matter, when they really don't. Someone's ego is not only an illusion, but entirely insignificant, and having it ripped away will, or should, produce that epiphany. I don't think psychedelics can bring about world peace or anything like that, but I do think they can help some nasty personality traits. I think if every Karen in the world experienced an ego death, retail employee harassment would drop to nearly zero. We all need to be humbled. I try to take a psychedelic every few years, and I would like to continue to do so, just to keep an eye on myself, make sure I'm not becoming blind to a glaring flaw. Before ending, let me address those two popular responses for not wanting to do psychedelics.
I don't like giving up control.
I get it. It's really scary to give up control. Your entire life may be balanced right now. Work, family, friends. It may not be perfect, but it's working, and your mind is keeping a nice homeostasis. Mental experimentation runs the risk of shaking things up, changing your status quo. So I get not wanting to mess with that. But I'd just say this. If you ever find yourself at a low or in a rut, don't be afraid to take a chance and shake things up. It might be just what you need to find your way.
I'm scared of what I'll see.
This one I don't accept as a valid response. Personal growth is scary. It's supposed to be. But I think I've done a decent job of showing how diving into our fears makes us better. Self-critique, examination will never be fun, but it's how we get better. To those with this response, let me share a testimony from Natasha Young explaining what LSD did for them.
Regrettable patterns of behavior that had plagued me for years resolved into view with astounding, terrifying clarity. What I had internalized as faults to be hated, were revealed simply to be games, which I could choose to play or not.
Fear should never be a reason to not get better. Just a heads up to all my wonderful listeners, uploads are going to slow down significantly. My work hours are going way up until I reach my next goal in life, so I just don't have the time. Maybe one day I will if those fat cats in Washington ever vote my channel into office, or if I can get sponsored by Big Pharma. Until then,